Welcome, everybody, to another Tactics Tuesday for Brand Fortress HQ podcast. Today, we're going to talk about something a little bit different and kind of an exercise around launching new products since they are so important to growing a brand. And what we're going to look at is, how do you guarantee a failed product launch on Amazon? Because we want to walk through that process as a mental model. And this is something that actually comes from, I believe, Charlie Munger kind of popularized this idea of how do you take something that's successful and how do we invert it so that way we can see those things that we want to avoid. And I think this is really important as we think of, things that we want to make sure that we're addressing in that launch process to give ourselves the best chances for success. So we were talking a little bit before this, and I guess the first thing is, Mike, you had a really good comment before we hit record on kind of that first step of how you guarantee, a failed product launch on Amazon starts with what does success look like? So tell me a little bit more about how you think about, success for a product and how you'd invert that if we're looking at, a failed product launch.
Yeah, I think, first of all, it's hard to know what failure looks like if you haven't defined what success looks like. Otherwise you don't know whether you missed the mark or not. And I also would say that not defining success is the first step to a failed launch. Because if you don't know what you're looking for, then, ultimately there's no way you're going to hit that target. So, I would say, when you're looking at the idea of, what does a successful launch really look like? To some degree, that's dependent upon the product, and how much market share are you trying to get, those sorts of things. What type of a product is it a hero product? Is it a loss leader, something like that. But ultimately, there's a number of things that probably, you need to be dialing in on and also setting actual goals for to determine what that success looks like. So in other words, you should be setting some sales targets as to how many units or how much revenue or how, whatever the number is that you're going to shoot at, how many units should you hit within 30 days, or within 2 weeks, within 90 days, you should have. So a launch isn't just, the first few weeks after the product goes live, because if that's all you're paying attention to, chances are when you get through that first few weeks, you're going to start losing ground because you don't have a longer term strategy for what does that launch look like, because you have to carry that trajectory out for a ways before Amazon really understands your product well, begins to recognize, that it's a valuable competitor in that space, whatnot. So you really can't look at just that, first 2 or 3 weeks. So what are your sales targets going to be after, say, 2 weeks, 30 days, 90 days? What keywords do you want to secure ranking for? And what level of ranking do you think you can secure? Do you think you can hit number 1 on page 1? Do you think you can hit number 3 or number 4 on page 1? Like, what are you shooting for? Because again, depending on the size of the market, being number 3 in that category could be a super good place to be in terms of sales. In other cases, maybe you really kind of are shooting at, I need to be at the top of page 1. So what are the keywords you want to rank for? What ranking do you think would be a success? And again, how are you going to hold those rankings? How are you going to earn, or did you earn, we'll say, in terms of defining success, a steady stream of positive reviews and ratings? If you didn't have anything in place, then you're probably not going to get a whole lot of reviews and ratings out of that launch. And I would consider that a failure, because even if you were to get some ranking, if you don't have any reviews on that, then you're going to have a hard time maintaining that. Also, were you able to maintain healthy margins, or at least some profit margin on that launch, or was the launch itself an actual loss? I don't think it has to be. Most people walk into a launch assuming they're going to lose money on it, and hopefully they're going to make up for it on the back end. I don't think that has to be the case. And then again, how are you building a foundation for long-term and repeatable sales growth that's going to be able to continue long-term? I think those are the ways that I would define success. Maybe you guys have some things you'd like to add to that, but.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of great things that I hear out of what you said that I just want to break down a little bit. I mean, I think the first thing is, defining what success looks like. And, I think this is kind of an extension of a, discussion that we had last week of, what is the role of that product? Is that going to be a hero product? Is it going to be a tripwire product where it introduces people to your brand? Is it, maybe something complementary to one of your hero products where it's kind of an add-on that adds to, customer lifetime value? Like, identifying what that strategy up front, I think, is going to give a much better idea of what that launch playbook should look like, in the sense of, if it's for example, if it's a complementary product, well, then you probably don't need, a super aggressive launch with, a whole bunch of ad spend and stuff like that. When you're
Right.
looking at, hey, this is going to be a product that, well, may only have incremental sales. Maybe you have really good margins on that complementary product. So I think, yeah, starting with, what that strategy is super important. And if you don't have a strategy, then that's one of the best ways that you can ensure that you're going to fail, is because you don't know what good looks like right out of the box. So that makes it really hard to know, make these kind of, tactical decisions that we're talking about around how to execute that strategy.
Once you define what success looks like, I think a lot of what Mike said success looks like is a part of that is doing your competitor research and really understanding who the competitors are. And a lot of what Mike said in the beginning, I mean, I think a really good way to guarantee a failed product launch is not using the tools that we have available to us that basically give you x-ray vision into the category, all of the competitors, where they're getting their sales from. I mean, there's a wealth of information that these tools give you that really direct your launch on what keywords you're going to go after, where, once you decide and determine where your top competitors are getting most of their sales from, which keywords, then it's a fairly easy to build a map of what keyword you're going to go after in terms of PPC and where you're going to put them in your listing. So, I mean, it all really starts with competitor research on Amazon using the tools that are available to you. And if you're not, then I think that's a really good way to guarantee a failed product launch. Is it not understanding not only who they are, but where they're getting their sales from on Amazon?
Well, I think the other part of that, in terms of that competitor research portion, and I think absolutely you guarantee failure if you haven't done that, because it's not just about keywords, it's also, pricing analysis. How am I going to price the product? Well, you kind of need to know what the market is, what's the low end, what's the high end, what's the median, like you need to know what are the features that your competitors are offering in their product, and do customers care about those features, one, and two, do they like them? Like, do they think that your competitors are actually nailing those, particular features? Because again, another really good way to likely fail in a launch is to not differentiate enough. Now, again, it may be that, depends on the type of product it is. Maybe you don't need a lot of differentiation. Maybe you have a strong brand. This is just a complementary product, in which case differentiation isn't necessarily the key. It's just, hey, this is another product that we can sell to that same customer. And so, you don't have to, but you still have to do the research on the front end. It's always, if you can, if there's an easy way to differentiate yourself, whether that's in the product itself or even just in the listing, then you should do that. And it takes research, to know what that differentiation looks like, and how to do it, what things to highlight on your listing that maybe competitors aren't highlighting, those sort of things. So.
Yeah, I would say, just to piggyback off of what you said, Mike, about pricing, I think that's so important, and something that a lever that isn't pulled enough. And so a couple of things to think about with that when you think about pricing is, and we talk about failed product launches, and that is making sure that you have, some source to get those initial sales on your product, whether that's, using, a list that you have pre-built, or, ads or something like that. Because I think what a lot of people who maybe haven't launched a product in a while don't realize is that, if you're planning on offering some sort of discounts or something like that on your product, that you have to have a reference price to start with. And if you don't have any sales right out of the gates, you may want say you want to sell the product for $100, like you want that to be your reference price, but you're on the higher end of the market. Well, if you don't have any reviews and you don't have any sales velocity, it's going to be really hard for you to get those, first few reviews and first few sales if you don't have some sort of, list for your brand or some other resource in order to drive traffic. And so having, a failed product launch where if the only thing that you have in order to get visibility for that product is ads from Amazon, it's going to be really tough and really expensive to get any sort of velocity on that product if you are on the higher end or you're a premium end product, and trying to price yourself accordingly when you don't have, the ratings or the other social proof that people would expect from a higher end product and that listing on Amazon.
I definitely suggest selling at the high end of the price point, no matter what category you're in. And a big part of that, commanding a higher price point and giving a premium feel, is also your listing. I mean, if you're not showing in your main image and you're not helping the consumer to understand why your product is the one to choose, and you don't get very many opportunities to do that, especially in very crowded search results. So I think another way to guarantee a failed product launch is to not spend the resources, whether that be time or money, to really make your main image and your copy and the rest of your images really, really stand out. I think that the amount of time that people spend reading copy has decreased pretty significantly. So that means that our images are more important now than they've ever been. So I think another way to guarantee a failed product launch is to not put the necessary resources into having really, really standout images. And now there's starting to be less and less of an excuse for that. I just the other day was touching up some images using ChatGPT's image generating tool. And I mean, it did things that I was getting ready to have to send to a graphic designer, and it did it in a couple of prompts. So especially if your product, there's a couple of different types of products that I think AI are still having a hard time with, like pool cleaning tools, for example. For the life of no large language model understands what a pool brush or a pool skimmer are. So I think in some categories it's not as prevalent using AI tools like that. But yeah, I think focusing on at least your main image and making sure that that is better than your competitors, and running split tests and really knowing that it's going to convert at least as good as your competitors is really important in the beginning. And if you don't, then you're going to have an uphill battle.
Yeah, I would say, just going back to what both of you said, John, essentially, the thing that I think is critical there, like you were talking about, trying to get some of those initial sales at the price point that you want to be your reference point.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be a whole lot easier to get those sales from individuals that already trust you. So, maybe you can get friends and family, maybe, something like that. But honestly, it's good to be able to get that from an audience, a community that you have built or that you are piggybacking on, it's always best to have your own audience as you can. But when you don't have one, then the time it takes to build an audience can be considerable, especially if you're not very good at lead gen and things like that. If you have that background, then you can probably do that and you probably understand what you're doing. But if you don't, then piggybacking on somebody else's community, if they're the right avatar for your product, and we've talked about this a billion times, but that is the simplest, easiest, quickest way to find an audience that's going to trust you based on your association with the person that they already trust, which is the person that built the community. And so in that case, when you don't have reviews on your product, if you can gain that trust through another source and access their community, then you have that opportunity to sell at full price. You can always do a little bit of a rebate on the back end. If you do, you don't want to publicize this and make it a big thing, obviously, because Amazon doesn't like it. But on a small scale, for a limited number of orders in a private community or something like that, it's not really that difficult of a thing to be able to sell some full price orders at your reference price and maybe give a rebate on the back end. Or maybe it's not even a rebate. Maybe it's some other freebie that they get, like you've created something that they get as a result or something. It doesn't have to be a discount, but to get those, reference price purchases. But also, again, going back to this, and it's not like we haven't harped on this, for ages, but, if you have that audience, it's not just useful for getting those reference price purchases. It's also useful for actual launch purchases. Like, when we launch a product, having an email list of 1,000 people that already trust our brand, that is gold, for a product launch. And as long as you have a pattern to make sure that you can sustain sales after that and try to maintain ranking and whatnot, which is not easy, but at least it gives you the opportunity to get a lot of sales up front. Again, a lot of reviews on the front end, because those people who actually trust you and like your brand are going to be far more likely to go give you a review, especially if you ask them on the front end, hey, do me a favor, go buy this product and then leave us a review. you're going to have a much better, conversion rate, let's say, to reviews from those orders. So that launch audience is really incredibly important. And then on the back end of that, the product listing, Matt, you mentioned, hey, make sure that you're actually dialing in on and optimizing that listing. Well, one of the things that I think is important for our audience to know and to remember, and again, not like we don't harp on this all the time, but if you don't know who you're selling to, then how do you know how to optimize your product listing? Like you can optimize it for keywords, and things like that, sure. But one of the things that Matt's talking about is not just getting the keywords right and all of those sort of things and making sure you highlight specific, benefits in your images and that sort of thing. But part of it is, what is the feel of the imagery, and does it have a cohesive feel? And is that feeling, is that emotion that it evokes, the emotion that you want it to evoke for the person that you actually want to sell to most? And if you don't know who that avatar is, if you don't know who that person is, then you really don't know how to engender that specific emotion through your imagery, because you don't know who you're speaking to. So if you haven't taken the time to analyze who it is you're selling to, then again, you're guaranteeing, if not a failed launch, you're certainly guaranteeing a far more expensive launch and a much more difficult road to success.
Yeah, and I want to circle back to, something that, Mike, you've talked about in the past and comes from having that list as well, that almost back to the beginning, which is, as you look at, because most of the brands that are listening to this, you probably are selling, already, some product, you have a hero product or products on Amazon that you've got some traction with. And I think going back to, Mike, what you've talked about of leveraging your audience as to, what should that next product be, I think is something that is incredibly powerful. That when we look at, how do you guarantee a failed product launch? Part of that is, just, sticking to, horse blinders on, looking at products and maybe, just looking at keywords and saying, okay, this is going to be, that next hero product, rather than saying, okay, here's what I think that product is going to be. And then going to a portion of your list and saying, hey, we're thinking about developing product A, product B, and product C. Which one of these interests you the most? Okay, getting some information from there. So now you have a little bit of, actual data from your customers, and then taking that extra step to say, maybe even get on a call with somebody or a Zoom or something like that to say, hey, here's the benefits or features that we're thinking about really focusing on, and here's how we're differentiating it and making it better than other products that are out there. And, they might tell you, yep, that sounds fantastic. Or they may be like, yeah, I don't really care about that. And then getting those samples and actually having them try it and say, hey, I love this about it, or I don't love that, which is a ton of work that, I think a lot of brands don't do up front, which is why they have kind of mixed results when they launch products, is because, at that point, you're just kind of guessing of, what your customers that you've built into your brand want. And sometimes you're right and sometimes you're wrong. And when you're wrong, that's when, your product launches end up falling flat, and you end up investing a lot of money into product that, doesn't really move the needle in the long run.
Well, and I hate to step in here because I kind of would like to give Matt a chance to talk, but I think it's important to point out on that is that, one, you'll talk to a lot of Amazon sellers who, sure, once you get good at this, you can kind of get a sixth sense a little bit about, the kind of products that may succeed or fail, but it's still just that, it's still a guess at the end of the day. And in that, you really have to be a lot more careful with the launch in terms of, how much you spend on it, and in terms of how much inventory you buy and things of that nature, because there's at least an average chance that the product does not succeed to nearly the level that you expected it to or hoped it would, because it's based on a guess. Whereas if you have, tested this out with an audience, if you talk to your audience, what product would you want? If you talk to them about what features they might want, if you talk to them about what they don't like about the features of other products, what color do they want? What, we'll spend months, in that conversational process with our email audience about a new product, letting them know, number one, that we think this is what we want to come out with. Is that something you'd be interested in? And going through all of that, but then also, okay, we have it. Does anyone want to prototype it? Do you want to beta test? here's what the results were. We're going back to the drawing board to fix these things. And I've said this before, but by the time it comes time for a launch, that audience feels like it's their product, like they developed it, and in that you gain a lot of confidence that the launch is going to go well, because one, you already know you're selling a product that a whole bunch of people in that space that represent your avatar have already said they like the features that you created. They've tested it and it works well. The features that you've invested in are actually performing the way they expected them to. And so now then you also have this large audience that you get to launch it to, generally speaking, at a much lower discount than to people who don't know anything about the product or anything about your brand. So you can launch much more profitably. But what that also means is you can invest in more inventory on the front end. And that is what I think is the next critical piece of this. And that is you cannot afford to stock out either during or after your launch. Especially if you've seen success with that launch and you stock out, you screwed the whole thing. And so it's way more of a risk to order too little inventory than too much. Too much inventory is a scenario where you can probably still rectify that, because even if the launch didn't go great, you can always liquidate the inventory. You can almost always sell the inventory at least at cost and come out break even. So that to me is the worst case scenario from buying too much inventory. But the worst case scenario of buying too little inventory is you invest a lot of time and effort and money in that launch, and then you stock out, and now you don't know if you're going to be able to regain those rankings. And that's a huge risk that I think it's not worth taking. And if you already know on the front end, this is 90% likely to be a really strong success because I know what my audience thinks and I know they're going to buy it, it makes it a lot easier to spend that money on the front end and buy a lot more inventory up there, knowing that it's likely to be a success.
If you've done everything if you've gone through all of these steps and you haven't guaranteed your product launch and things are going really well and you end up running out of inventory and not paying attention to this piece, my best launch to date, I ran out of inventory. Now, COVID did play a part in that, but my best launch to date never recovered after running out of inventory that first time. Now, that doesn't happen with all products, and there are ways. Now, this was not only was this a brand new product, but it was a brand new brand. So I didn't have an audience yet. I did have kind of a tangential audience that I could point there, and I did, but it wasn't anything like, my other brands where I had a big giant Facebook group. So it can't be stated enough. I mean, you might knock the initial launch out of the park, but if you don't have the follow-up inventory to replenish after, I personally have gone through my best launch and not been able to recover. I spent a lot of money trying. I tried PPC. I tried all the things that I did initially to get the launch out of the gates. And I mean, it was screaming out of the gates, but it not only did it ruin the launch, but it essentially put that brand in a really, really big hole right out of the gate by not just initial. I did have initial inventory. Now the launch went so successfully that I blew through 3 months worth of what I thought was going to be inventory in about 3 weeks, but I didn't have the follow-up inventory to replenish afterwards. And that was very, very, very detrimental to not only that product launch, but also the brand in general.
Yeah, I think inventory is one of those underrated things for new products. I would say the other thing too is that, even if all those things do go well, making sure that you have, again, within Amazon terms of service, which we've talked about before, but a way of, asking for those reviews on the product, because that is one of the biggest, when you start looking at reviews on your listing. I mean, when we're talking about Amazon, that probably is one of the strongest kind of barometers that you have for brand, of not only, what is your rating, but how many total reviews do you have on that listing? Because the reality of it is, if we look at the conversion rate for, a product that has 2 reviews and a 5-star listing versus a product that has, 1,000 reviews and a 4 point, even if it's a 4.4 rounded up to a 4.5 stars, the product with 1,000 reviews is going to convert better. And it's just, kind of boils down to what that social proof is of, every customer when they're looking at it saying, is this product going to work for me? I think the other thing that maybe gets underrated that we haven't talked about yet, if we're looking at, hey, guaranteed product launch or failed launch, is, not having something, especially when we start looking at those search query results, that looks different, or excuse me, the search results to even get the clicks to the listing. So I think now, in a lot of categories, a lot of products look really, really similar. And the problem with that is that if you're the new kid on the block, you have to look different and you have to say something different in that first 80 characters of your title in order to get people to click into your listing, because that is half the battle when we look at, especially for a new product, of being able to make a sale, is just getting somebody to click on your listing. And, at least from my experience, especially in, 2025, when we're recording this, you really have to look and sound different from everybody else that's on those search results in order to see some success with that.
I think it's probably also important to pay attention just from a psychological perspective on what that looks like, because your click through is determined by your image and your title. I mean, that's and price and deliver. How soon can it be delivered? So those are things too, like distribution of your inventory. Is going to be a factor in terms of how short is your delivery window. That's going to affect your CTR. But let's look at the things that you're paying attention to. So when somebody's scrolling through the listings, the very first thing that's going to get them to stop and pay attention, as you said, John, is the image. Like, the title's not what's going to stop them. They're not reading titles as they scroll. They're scrolling through images, and when they see an image that interests them, then they read the title. And so in that, recognize that no matter what you have in your title, if your image does not give them a reason to stop scrolling, then you've already lost the battle. And so I think that's a key point, that, as you're optimizing that to get that best click through, make sure that image is going to stop them. By the same token, you have to make sure that you're not going to create a bunch of clicks that don't convert. So You could create an image that will get really good click through. But if you haven't created a listing that ties into that image and into the title, so that when they click through, what they're seeing is what they expect to see, or what they're seeing is better than what they expect to see when they look at that image and that title, then you're going to pay a lot for clicks and you're going to get really low conversion rate, and then you're still screwed. So it's not just about clicks, it's also about conversion, but you have to get both. If you don't get any clicks, then your conversion rate's irrelevant. And if you get a whole bunch of clicks and no conversion rate, then you just spend a boatload and you don't make any money. So you got to pay attention to both ends of that.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, especially around the, looking at the clicks. And it's not a clicks or conversion rate, it's clicks and conversion rate. Because I do see this, fairly often, especially when, a client that we're working with might have a product that, they, quite frankly, they have an emotional attachment to. It's maybe their third or fourth product that they've launched, and they're like, wow, I think this thing is really great. And we look in there and they're like, oh, my conversion rate is fantastic. And then, they've had like 100 sessions in the last 30 days. And they're like, yeah, my conversion rate's 20%. I'm like, okay, well, if I 10X your sessions, what does that conversion rate look like? And I think that's the important thing to look at is that, once you start really amping up the volume, does that conversion rate drop down dramatically? Right. And in a lot of cases it does, because the only people that are coming through are, the absolute, hottest leads that are interested in that product, even though, the main image doesn't make the most sense, the title doesn't necessarily make the most sense, but they know the brand, or, there could be a million different reasons, but, they're kind of that, 1% of buyers that you're serving, that are at the absolute hottest leads, but you're missing out on the other 99% that you could have if you had that listing set up properly for that product.
I think another thing that you can do to guarantee a failed product launch is not pay attention to all of these numbers that we're talking about, and just launch and sit back and hope that sales are coming in and you're just checking your bank account. If you're not checking your click-through rate and you're not checking your conversion rate and you're not looking to see the search query performance report, then you don't know what the baseline is. Yeah, you can do a lot of research in the beginning, but things very rarely are going to go exactly how you thought that they were going to go once you actually start selling. So paying attention to all of these stats and watching what your click-through rate does as you change out your main image, and split testing your main image with Manage Your Experiments or a tool like PickFu or product pinning or something something like that. I think that is also, yes, that's part of optimizing as your product becomes a lot more mature, but that's also a lot of the product launch also is paying attention to those numbers and watching what they do. I think building that muscle early on during your product launch is going to set you up for success. And if you aren't paying attention to that, then set you up for a potential failure.
What I would build off that, Matt.
Sorry, go ahead, John.
Well, I was going to say, to build off that a little bit, we talk quite a bit about, the product itself, and to go a little bit more tactical, and some of those products, some of those, some products hit, some don't. And I think the same thing is true when you talk about what you expect to be your hero keywords as well, in the sense that, typically for a product, and again, it depends on how many resources you have, what category you're in, and how competitive it is. But just say, for example, you've got 3 to 5 kind of hero keywords where you're like, hey, I think these are going to drive, the majority of my sales. I think it's really important to pull apart that data and why ads are so important in that early phase, especially for those exact match keywords, to really see what does that look like. Because, I think there's been enough times where we've seen, maybe 1 or 2 of those keywords where the click-through rate and the conversion rate is dramatically better than the others. And looking at, okay, how do we double down on those keywords that are working for us rather than trying to, push hero keywords that we kind of wish or hoped or thought were going to be successful for us. And I think getting really granular with the data, especially on the ad side, gives you, full visibility into that sales funnel to see what keywords are working for you.
Yeah, for sure. It's, nothing is ever going to work out the way that you expected it to work out. Hopefully, the best that you can hope for is that you're directionally accurate, and then lean into the aspects of that end up being the most successful portions of the campaign, and really push on that. Down the road, you can always push on some of those other keywords that you really thought were going to be, drivers that maybe weren't during the launch, but it doesn't mean they can't be afterward. But during the launch, paying attention to what is working and leaning into, those aspects to really keep that launch moving forward, I think is a critical piece. I also think it's probably important to point out that depending on the size of your team, there's only so much that you can pay attention to all at once. So one of the things that I would recommend, and there's a fine line here, and I've said before that as ProTough, I think we have sometimes erred on well, I don't want to say the wrong side of the line, but we, instead of riding the line, we kind of pulled back from it. What I mean by that is you really should be consistently launching products. It is the best way to guarantee long-term success and increasing revenue numbers and profitability. So, because for a lot of reasons, one of which is the more products you have, the more cross-sell and upsell opportunities you've got, the more, back-end selling you can do if you're building a list. There's all sorts of reasons why having, that larger list of products is useful. But the big thing is, though, your team is still only so big. And so I would recommend, first of all, that you do, within reason, as much of the work before the launch as you can. So, because once the launch happens, then everything is just this, churning chaos, trying to make sure that you're managing everything and getting it all right. If you're well prepared for that launch, though, and you've done all the research up front, you really have optimized the listing, you've created numerous different versions of your main image so that you can be testing those during the launch. You've created numerous different versions of your title so that you can maybe test those during your launch. The more you prepare before the launch, the easier the launch becomes and the fewer people it requires to be able to manage and pay attention to all these things. Like we're talking about, monitoring your keyword performance and monitoring, all of these things about the launch. If it's just you, that can be a little bit tough to manage, especially if it's a high volume product and there's other things going on. So I think before the launch, decide on what are the most critical aspects that you need to pay attention to as the launch is progressing that will help you determine, is it moving in the direction of success or is it moving away from success? And what are you going to do about it? Because you can't focus on everything. You're not going to have the time. Unless you've got a decent sized team, you can't focus on every single little KPI. But if you focus on the main ones, what's your CTR, what's your CVR, what's your sales numbers per day? Are they increasing? Are they decreasing? Whatever. Then at least you've got a chance, being able to make the adjustments that need to be made when they need to be made.
Yeah, and I think so. This might be a good place to wrap because I think you bring up a couple of good points there that I think are a couple of my takeaways. Which is the first is that I think first of all, when we talk about mistakes, probably the biggest mistake is not launching a new product. Like if you just said, "Hey, I'm not going to launch a new product," that is probably the biggest mistake for a brand long term. And then what I would add on to that is that don't bet the farm on a new product launch. Because especially if you're not doing these on a regular basis or you haven't done one in a while, you're probably, gonna miss a couple of important steps in what we've just covered today. And sometimes that's okay because if, maybe you're a one-person team, maybe you're still just a one-person wrecking crew. You can only get out, one new product a year. Well, going through that process at least once a year is going to make you 10 times more effective than if you just don't do it at all. Because I have talked to I can think of one client right now that, hasn't launched a new product in probably 3 or 4 years. And he is deathly afraid of launching a product that's not going to work out. And the reality of it is that even if you do everything perfect, there's no, guaranteed magic formula that your product launch is going to be perfect. And, sometimes just getting in and doing it and learning from that process and continuing to evolve is going to give you a better result in the long term than trying to make one product launch perfect and never getting off the launch pad. So I'd say that's my biggest takeaway. I'll leave it to you guys to kind of share maybe one or two of the biggest, kind of mistakes that you guys see and that you would, want listeners to take away from this conversation.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we've talked about and something that we talked about a lot actually just with ProTup not too long ago is inventory. Inventory plays a really big part of this. Again, there's tools out there that tell you that kind of walk you through what your competitors are in what they're doing in terms of sales velocity. Over ordering, I think is we've talked about in here and defined that's less of a risk than under ordering. So I think inventory, paying attention to inventory, crafting the right plan in the very beginning and making sure that you have enough and making sure that you never run out of inventory, I think is the biggest takeaway for me.
I think one other thing that I want to mention is just failure isn't fatal. Learn from it, but also in specific to a launch, I think it's probably also important to recognize that technically, just because you fail a launch doesn't mean that product has to be a failure. And in my opinion, it may be such that if a launch starts going sideways and you feel like this is not really going the direction that you wanted, and it looks like maybe there's not a good way to pull out, and when I say pull out, I mean really kind of pull up, let's say, and turn what is looking like a failed launch into a success, maybe the better solution is to pull out and try again. Remove that inventory, restructure whatever it is that you're going to do, in terms of what went wrong, what didn't you do right, what did you miss, what were the pieces that didn't happen, and and maybe make a decision to relaunch. Now, you're going to have to make the decision before you go removing inventory because, again, like we said earlier, you could always liquidate. And that's another option, okay, the launch didn't go well. I'm going to liquidate this inventory instead of removing it and trying to relaunch. Figure out what went wrong, because if I still think this is the product that should have succeeded, right? But I know the errors that I made, and I'm really sure that the launch didn't succeed because of those, then whether I remove the inventory and try again, or whether I liquidate the inventory and then restructure things, create a new listing and do it again, order the inventory up again, maybe change the product if there was something about the product that was the problem, and try again. There's no reason you can't do that. I'm not saying you have to. Some products are a failure because the product itself is a failure, and there's really no way that you're going to rectify that. But if you really can see where the errors were and you think there's a way to make that a success, you can always try again. And you learned a lot from the first launch. Hopefully the second launch will go better because you learned those things and you fixed them. So
before you wrap it up, John, and to bring it full circle, if you didn't define what success looked like at the very beginning, then you have no way of judging if it was a failure or not. So full circle again, you have to define what success looks like at the very beginning.
Absolutely, Matt. And you know what? I think that's a great place to wrap for today. So thank you for bringing us around full circle. And thank you, everybody, for listening to another Tactics Tuesday.